Hi everyone, and welcome back for the second in the series of EMEA Partner Masterclasses. This is a series for any field-focused sales and pre-sales people within our partner base involved in driving with their customers. My name is Mark Mason. I have the pleasure of leading our indirect business in EMEA today, and we're joined this afternoon by Caroline Payne and Mark Clouet. Caroline is an experienced salesperson with HashiCorp, having been here for over 3 years and having helped multiple customers on their journey to adopt Terraform Enterprise. We'll hear from Caroline on how she positions Terraform, how she helps to guide the adoption journey, and some of the key outcomes Terraform has driven for all of our customers. But first, Mark Clouet will walk us through the overview of Terraform, the recent release of Terraform Cloud, and the value that we're positioning with our global customers. We look forward to engaging with you in the field, and if you haven't already, please ensure to block your calendars for the third episode of the Masterclass series on May 18th, where we'll cover HashiCorp Vault. Thank you again for your time, your attention, your continued support, and we look forward to continuing to build a thriving partner ecosystem with you. Mark, over to you.
Cool, thank you everyone. Thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. Let me just quickly share my slides. Here we go. So just as a small recap of the last session, we talked in the last session about the cloud operating model and how HashiCorp and the industry are changing, how we are adopting more dynamic data centers where we include private cloud, we include all kinds of public clouds as well. And that means that we need to change the way we provision and maintain these platforms. And we're focusing today on Terraform, right? So one of the first questions that a lot of customers ask, and a lot of to the partners and to ourselves, is what is modern provisioning, right? And this, to me, is a very good breakdown of what modern provisioning looks like. We start to set at the bottom with an API that in a way to communicate with all the different public clouds, or a HAL, which is a hardware abstraction layer. So the Pixie boots, the microkernels, all these kinds of things that do offer ways to connect through the network to physical hardware. And then once we get there, then we install on top of that an operating system of sorts. And that can be your flavor of Linux of the day, your Windows server. It can also be the microkernels. It can also be the serviceless environments. And that will give you, said, an operating system fully running in order for you to be able to start configuring stuff on that. And then we go to the specialization phase. The specialization phase of this operating system is adding on top of the operating system all the requirements that your business needs, that are part of your security, are part of your single sign-on, part of your audit, part of even of your governance and risk requirements, right? And then once we have that, then we start configuring the machine for its real function. And its real function, which can be any of the different functions that we have nowadays for the different I would say micro applications, microservices that we have. Then once we get there, we have all the dependencies of the application. We have all the specialization, all the requirements for single sign-on, tracking, logging, monitoring, etc., the operating system, the API. Then we need to start adding the application on top. And first part of that is the dependencies of application. What kind of libraries does the application have? What kind of services does the application need in order to operate? And the final step of that is installing the application itself. So if you look at all of this, then in reality, this is divided in 3 different things. It is divided in what we call pure provisioning. And the pure provisioning, in my opinion, it stops at the point where we already have an operating system, or where we can already do that deployment of that application for serviceless. Then we have all the part that is covered by the config management function. And config management does the specialization of the machine for the business requirements, security requirements, single sign-on, monitoring, etc. And all the configuration of the machine for the environment it operates, or for the function it needs to do. And this config management part, you can do that in many ways. There's several solutions on the market that do that, but there's also people that do that with scripting, with small scripts that are one-way scripts that do that. And then the last part, of course, is the deployment. And I think this kind of schema is very useful, especially for partners when they try to sell to customers, to be able to have a very clear differentiation of the domain and function of each one of these categories. Because I said, if we try to get Terraform to do more than provisioning and go all the way to the configuration, we may have a degraded experience where we want to make sure that we provide the maximum value for what the customer is buying. And Terraform is very good at this. It's very good at provisioning. It provides this unified way of provisioning. You define all your infrastructure as code. As you know, all this code is human readable through ACL, the HashiCorp code language. And ACL has been defined and designed with practicality and human readiness in its heart. So we make sure that everything can be read, everything can be interpreted, and you don't need to go through all kinds of YAML hell, JSON hell, or anything else in order to define your platform. And then you have the Terraform core, which is what identifies, reads this code, and creates all these execution steps. And Terraform, as you know, it's a declaratory language. So in the sense that you will declare the end state of the platform, and then Terraform will calculate all the steps, will plan all the steps in order to get there. And at the end, you get, I said, you get this output, which can be logs, can be any kind of information that you want to pass, or the next step in the pipeline, which can be passing over to a config management agent or passing over to a deployment agent. One of the advantages of Terraform, and for me, one of the main ones, is that when the code is defined properly, you have a unified way to be able to provision across many different environments. And many different environments can be anything from a data center to a private cloud, to a virtual environment, to a public cloud, to serverless, anything that you want to do. What is the real advantage of this? The real advantage of this is that you avoid having many different code repositories with the same function on different environments. So for example, if you're trying to maintain code to pixie boot your data center and do all the install, then you have another set of code that does the same for installing operating systems on VMware, and another one for your AWS cloud. You need to maintain 3 different lines of code by 3 different people. That means extra resources, extra cost, extra complication as well, because any kind of problem that you have with that pipeline, any kind of issue or any kind of upgrade, you need to do that 3 times. You need to upgrade that 3 times. You need to test that 3 times across 3 different environments with complications. And that's where Terraform really, really shines. If you want to maintain code across different environments, it's very, very useful. But not only that, one of the things that I always say to partners is that even if the customer is working in one single cloud, Terraform is incredibly useful in the sense that it gets you a key out of jail in a way, because as you know, all the different public cloud providers, when they define their infrastructure, when they define the way you operate in the cloud, they have different solutions, and these solutions are normally proprietary, are normally only available on that cloud. It's part of their competitive advantage, but at the same time, it's something that will make more difficult for you to be able to operate to a different cloud provider or to be able to move to a different cloud provider. I have an example of a customer of mine that we had to move from AWS to Azure due to a decision by the CTO. And as we had Terraform there already, it was fairly easy to do because it was a question of 2 weeks of work, just testing that all the code worked, making small changes to it when needed, and we were able to migrate everything to Azure in under 2 weeks, where if we had to do all of this from zero, define everything from zero, we would need to go through all the approval process, through all the architecture process, all the rest that has already been done for AWS. We will have to repeat that with great cost, and it would take months to be able to do that. But not only that, but also one thing that is fairly important is that Terraform has been designed with pipelines in mind. It's something that integrates very well with pipelines, especially with the API support that we give. You can add libraries, you can add programmatically, Terraform into your pipelines, get those plans, get that as part of your CI structure, and get Terraform as an integral part of your continuous deployment as well. And this gives you a lot of power in the sense that you can not only deploy to different clouds and different environments, but also you can deploy across the globe. You can use the same code at different hours. You can use the same solutions to be able to deploy to many different architectures. And this gives a competitive advantage to any of your customers because it gives them the chance to be able to operate with the best in-breed technology for whichever product the customer wants to sell, right? Because nowadays, and you will find this more and more, customers do not only concentrate on one single stack. They do not concentrate on one single flavor. You will have part of the solution in Kubernetes. You will have part in VMs running Node.js or in a database that is a software as a service. You will have another part easily in a serverless function somewhere. So you need to find the ways to be able to integrate all of that, keep control of that, and keep the security and the provisioning and the costs of all of it in line. So when we get to all of these, there's one of the things that I think it's fairly important. And this is for me, all the different challenges that growing your infrastructure as code, growing your company will have. And the important thing to remember is that when you are growing your infrastructure, when you're growing your business, it will be always a problem in the future, right? It will be always the kind of thing that we call the technical debt. And how do we get there, right? And when we get there, how do we pay this technical debt back? And a lot of business, what they do and what it happens is that they grow so fast that then the technical debt spirals out of control and they have huge problems being able to catch up with the volume they have. So this is one of the main reasons why we always proposition Terraform Enterprise, because it solves a lot of these problems for the customer already. It makes things a lot easier, right? And when we're talking about this enterprise level, this volume level, at the beginning, of course, when we talk, for example, when I go through each one of these, when we talk about access control, and we talk about the who access, what access, and when can they access it. At the beginning, it's fairly easy, right? You get your Terraform in place, you have a small team of 1, 2, 3 persons, and everything's just working until the point that you have 10, 15, 20 different persons that need that access. Then this starts to become a lot more difficult. You lose control of what's been accessed, and you are exposing yourself to risk. And I wouldn't say to risk because there's a malicious actor, but mainly to risk because there's no real coordination between all the different people when they're creating this code. So this is something that we solve through Terraform Enterprise with all the different pipelines with Sentinel that we use as policy as code, and all the API integration. So we get immediate feedback on the code before it even reaches any stage that we can actually create infrastructure with it. Then, of course, is the fallacy of cost, right? As you know, in different public clouds, there's always this thing that people say that going to cloud is always cheaper, but it is cheaper if cloud is used properly, if cloud is used with microservices, if it's used in a way that is effective, and if you have a proper FinOps department. And FinOps is financial operations, which is something that has been coming on a lot for the last 2-3 years. The thing that will happen if you don't have this cost control is that all your budget will be eaten in a lot less time than you expect. It will be a lot more expensive to be able to operate in the cloud. Because normally what happens is that when you democratize your infrastructure, when you give everyone a chance to be able to deploy what they need in order to operate the service, is that they will always try to size up whatever they need, because it is fairly difficult to have a very good idea of what is the real power available to you in a virtualized environment when you don't have experience with it. So what happens then is that people will size up, will oversize always what they need, and they will keep running like that because normally it's running fine, because of course you're putting it more power than what it needs. So there's no real problem, except that you're paying more than you should. You are actually burning through money and you're wasting money. And these, with Terraform, we can solve these. Terraform Enterprise gets all the part of, with Sentinel, we have proper FinOps integrated. So same with code review process. When we have a very small team, it's very easy to review the code. When you have 20 to 40 to 100 contributors to the code, you need to have guidelines with all of these. Same with policy compliance. How do we know that all this code that has been created, we can actually use it to do in a way that is within the security parameters of the company, within the governance and risk parameters of the company? Same with security. When can we do the pen testing? How can we ensure that all the different frameworks of security are in place? And all of these, as I said, it's just some of the few problems, but one of the main important ones, and this is more of like an organizational one for me, is the self-service. We create this way for people to create infrastructure, to provision their infrastructure. How can they have a good experience with this? How can we ensure that it's friendly enough for everyone to be able to create the code they need? How can we ensure that the people that we have that are masters of provisioning, masters of providing all these codes through Terraform are not overloaded with requests? And how can we ensure that the experience for the customer is as good as possible, especially when we're talking about the digital transformation that most people will not have that in-depth 3, 4, 5 years experience into that Terraform provisioning. And that's where we can have what is called the configuration designer. With the configuration designer in Terraform Enterprise, what you can actually do is that you have a graphical interface to create this code. And this graphical interface makes the creation of all this code and all these pipelines a lot easier. So it lowers the barrier of adoption, it lowers the barrier of entrance for a lot of people. And the same with the audit, right? When we do all of these things for auditing, then the problem that we have is that if we are running all the other things, we have a separate CM solution, we have a separate logging solution, then we need to go through all of that. Then we need to investigate for any kind of violations of this audit. And we need a way to be able to check these and be able to stop this before it even happens. And this is something that we can actually do as well. And this is a point of great value for the customer. And lastly, but not leastly, we go through all the testing. Testing, as you know, is in modern platforms and in modern code is done through CI and CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. With all the CI part, the important thing, and that's the big advantage of CI, is to be able to give that feedback as quickly as possible into the errors, into the issues, into the styling problems that any kind of code has. And with policy as code, it's the same exact problem. We need to be able to feedback as quickly as possible and help the user, guide the user through all this experience. And that's where the API integration of this is very good. So as you can see, it's a lot of different problems. It's a lot of different challenges. And what happens in a lot of companies, and this is one of the points that I think is very important, is the build versus buy. Right? Do we want to build this practice? Do we want to build this function inside? Do we want to build all this code inside, or do we want to buy externally and be able to pass the risk or consume something that is enterprise grade and ready by a company that is expert in what they do? And a lot of companies decide to build internally. And the build internally, it's the dog fooding in a way. And the problem that you have with that is that it's a very nice challenge. It's very nice for the engineers to be able to work in this, but you will end with something like this, right? The project will always start in a way that it looks feasible, it looks sustainable, but as this project goes on in time, it will be more difficult to maintain. It might even require greenfielding, refactoring of all the code. Maybe the original people that wrote this code leaves the company, so you are in a position where you're in trouble, right? And that's what we call scaffolding. All this code is the scaffolding around a solution that is not ready, for what you want to do. And as the solution is not ready for what you want to do, then you start adding all this code and the scaffolding around it to try to make it do what you need. And this is something that I personally normally recommend against. And for the security implications, but also for the hidden cost implication, because all the time and effort that your engineers are putting into trying to maintain this scaffolding so it doesn't fall down, because it becomes critical part of your operation, then it's time that they cannot use to actually deliver value, to actually deliver what the future of your company look like, or what's the principal product of your company will look like. So then you end up paying more and more money and doing more effort to maintain this scaffolding. And now, as I said, Caroline, if you want to take over and explain a bit more from the sales position of how we position Terraform, if that's all right.
Hello everyone, I'm just trying to start my screen, video, etc. Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Payne. I am one of the strategic account managers for HashiCorp. What does that mean? I'm in the sales team, I'm in the customer facing team, and hopefully here today to impart some knowledge around Terraform Enterprise. So everything that Mark has just said is totally valid and makes total sense and should be the only thing that you do when you're talking about Terraform with your customers, our joint customers. So Terraform Enterprise, really to condense some of the items that that Mark's just talked around, the fundamental thing that Terraform Enterprise does versus Terraform open source in an organization, such as the ones you can see on screen, Petco, Decathlon, Barclays, Hulu, Cruise, just a handful of examples, is it marries high agility. How can I move really fast in infrastructure provisioning with high control? How do I put things in place that are preventative in nature, but don't slow down the workflow and my cloud adoption planning? So a lot of companies might think that high agility and high control can never sustain a long-term marriage, but actually we're here to tell you otherwise, because Terraform Enterprise does exactly that. So yeah, the fundamentals are provisioning infrastructure as code with inline compliance is a critical conversation that a lot of customers are starting to become aware of. So they love the power of Terraform, they love the underlying, infrastructure as code, but what they really need to do is start to consider everything as code. So start to think about using our extensive library of providers, start building their own modules, and start putting in some in-house, private module registries using Sentinel, our policy engine. And so what they do is they start building like a mini, like a mini cloud within inside the organization. You could call it, company cloud, and it might be leveraging AWS, Azure, and GCP, and some on-prem or some legacy items, VMware, for example, Oracle, OpenStack, whatever. But the fundamentals is that everything goes through Terraform to be provisioned, and everything that is provisioned is fully compliant when using Terraform Enterprise. So it's just a kind of a touch on the fundamental difference between an open source solution and an enterprise solution. And Mark's analogy of the scaffolding is something that is really critical to move away from for our joint customers. And the reason why is we've seen this several times where a customer will say, you know what, we'll use Terraform, we'll start with infrastructure as code, and they really like the power of it, which is fantastic. Then they bring in consultants and other folks and say, how do we do this? How do we do that? And probably your day one experience would be to provide them with that scaffolding, because that's what you do. You deliver services and code and things like that for our joint customers. But actually what that does in the long term is it slows the customer down. I've had experience with customers who have built a lot of workflows and scaffolding around Terraform open source, and two things have happened. One, critically, the cloud adoption program only hit 3% of adoption in the first year. This particular customer had a target of 60% cloud adoption, moving workloads from legacy on-prem servers to AWS and Azure. So they hit 3%, it's a really underperforming cloud program. Their cloud provider, one of their cloud providers, actually called us and said, why is it so slow for Terraform to be the provisioning engine to their cloud program? And the reason was they were essentially taking the long route round because of all of the compliance checks and things like that they were doing manually with humans. So at the end of the day, when those humans log off and go home, or just log off and go to another room, because of course we're all at home, the workflow, the provisioning engine stops. Another thing critically happened is, unfortunately, because of the lack of guardrails, a live trading app was actually brought down during trading hours in this particular financial services organization. So the scaffolding didn't help because people were just able to provision directly to the cloud without any form of compliance or checks or anything that was kind of in line with a fast feedback loop. And what I mean by that feedback loop and why I'm talking about everything as code is, with Terraform open source, you provision directly from your laptop, your local CLI to cloud. That's pretty much it. You can just write whatever you want, as long as you've got access to the cloud provider, you're done. You can just provision. Whereas this concept of everything as code, including policy as code, means that you build from a private module, a module that the customer or the company you work for as an engineer or developer has approved. You create the necessary code to start provisioning. You hit plan. You then have a policy check. Are you in compliance or are you not? If you are, great. Let's provision that infrastructure that you require. If you're not, instead of that policy check then failing and you having to either start all over again, or you having some guesswork, how do I get into compliance? Sentinel will actually say, you've done something wrong, you're out of compliance, and you can just go ahead and edit the code and start that plan and apply process again. So it's a very fast feedback loop for our customers, which means they're not having to put bodies in the way essentially and having to check code, which a lot of enterprise organizations actually do with Terraform open source, and then that just slows everything down. So now the Terraform adoption, and this is really something that I hope you'll listen out for when talking to your customers, kind of follows this kind of trajectory. So HashiCorp, we always talk about organizational complexity being the driver from open source to enterprise, because our enterprise products provide collaboration features, governance, compliance. They provide things like resiliency. So how do what would I do if Terraform went down? Well, you have an active setup because it's an enterprise solution. How do I start to really automate using the API that's available in our enterprise product, et cetera, et cetera. And this really here is to guide you with taking that customer through that adopt MVP, production ready, and then scale stage. And it really just starts to allow you to rethink when you're having customer conversations, how to position Terraform Enterprise and kind of when. And it's actually quite early, as you can see within the process, because of the items that Mark and I have discussed earlier on. Otherwise, all you're doing is building scaffolding for that customer, or that customer is building workflows that kind of circumvent the actual solution. And the idea at scale, as you can see, kind of the top right of the steps here is services, not products. And what I mean by that is, we want our customers, our joint customers, to be focused in on their business, delivering services to their internal customers, not building a provisioning engine like Terraform and building code around that to create something that's, as opposed to buying Terraform Enterprise. And the packaging reflects this kind of trajectory. So organizational complexity is again featured heavily here. With HashiCorp, the core provisioning engine will always be from an open source perspective. It drives us. It's the way that HashiCorp provides products is the critical technical element. solves the initial problem. How do I provision infrastructure as code? Terraform. Doesn't have to be open source or enterprise. Well, it doesn't have to be enterprise in essence, I should say. How do I start to collaborate? Well, you need our Terraform Cloud product, which is actually free up to a certain extent. But again, it really leaves the customer out on a limb. There's no real enterprise experience because there's no support, and so the engagement is just about how do I connect a few people together in a small team with something like Terraform. Terraform Cloud Business tier, which has a set of features and functionalities that's the same as Terraform Enterprise. Also comes with the support layer with HashiCorp. So if something goes wrong, HashiCorp are there to help. That trading app that I talked about earlier on, it was with an open source experience, so they had to rely on the community to figure out what happened. They couldn't leverage their HashiCorp relationship and SLA because it unfortunately didn't exist at the time. And then the Terraform Enterprise itself, that's for when customers need to host internally. So it's a self-hosted solution. It's not something that we deliver as a service. So there are some extra functionalities that probably just very large businesses need, as opposed to a software as a service solution from HashiCorp through Terraform Cloud. I'll just give you a few examples. Now, all of these case studies are actually available on our website, and we're happy to supply them. If anyone needs them, you can just ping us within this group here. But these are just a few kind of sound bites and examples of why some of these customers chose Terraform Enterprise, because they saw the problem as a much longer requirement than just simply, I need to provision something. Terraform's a great provisioning engine. They saw it as something that really underpinned their cloud adoption programs and how they interacted again with their internal customers. So these three companies are perfect examples who take Terraform Enterprise, they put it as the critical path, if you like, within their provisioning experience, and they rely on that so that they can go off and deliver services and not build products. So again, to my point earlier, this is a long-term solution for these types of companies. And I'm just going to talk a little bit here about some classic objections that we hear all the time here at Hashi with our Terraform customers. And I want to really emphasize here that partners on this call, you can really win big here, and you can win much bigger by engaging from a Terraform Enterprise perspective than you can if you just solely want to sell a few services for a short period of time. The critical angle that you need to be taking is leveraging a three-party relationship, us, you, the customer, because all three of us are actually more powerful than just two of us, right? If we're just dealing with the customer, we don't have the large resources that you guys do. We don't have a huge services organization. It's just not something that HashiCorp has. And the customer misses out on different expertise that are outside of the HashiCorp sphere. So this is, of course, where the three of us can win a lot better long term. And actually having a longer term partnership, again, the three-party partnership idea, is because it doesn't take 3 months for a company, an enterprise organization, to adopt Terraform and adopt cloud and just solve their cloud adoption program. Companies are putting money in to fund cloud adoption programs. They've been doing it for the last 3 years. They're going to do it for 3 more years, 4 more years, 5 more years, etc. This is a huge wave and change for a lot of our customers. So being that long-term partner is really, really powerful. So I'll just go through a couple of objections here. Again, we're coming up to the Q&A, so happy to take some questions, of course, around these. Probably quite an old objection now is we've already got a toolkit, and Mark touched on this earlier on. We use CloudFormation for AWS. We use VRA for VMware. We use ARM templates for Azure. So they're building out this kind of large toolkit, and they're calling it established. You know, we've got Azure engineers, we've got AWS engineers, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, what happens is they have to keep updating all different areas of the landscape. And the wider the landscape gets, the more tools they have in their toolkit. And so it's really not something that can take them to market quickly. It's something that they have to skill in each and every one of the tools that they use. And it just doesn't scale very well. So HashiCorp always positions itself as critically handling the workflow, not the technology. So we don't actually really care if a customer is using multi-cloud, a single cloud. The fundamentals are that we are the workflow that underpins their cloud adoption program. So for us, it's just about infrastructure as code. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from. So customers can start to skill within HashiCorp terms with HCP, and they can start to actually go to market much, much quicker. So again, you as partners can start to give them your skills. You can start to onboard, engage, train those customers with HCP and Terraform, HCL, pardon me, and Terraform to write Terraform code rather than, you know, having to coach on individual cloud provider tools. Build versus buy. Mark talked about this a little bit earlier on. We can build it ourselves around Terraform. And the talking points here really for our partners is, you, our partners, and HashiCorp have seen this fail before, unfortunately. We don't mean to be disrespectful. We understand you have skilled engineers and developers. The question is, do you want to build a product yourself, or do you want to handle, you know, the workloads that you have internally with your internal stakeholders, your internal customers, and start delivering services to them? And you as the partner can engage really long term here with Terraform Enterprise. Again, Terraform Enterprise is not about spinning it up and you know, day one you spin it up, day two you're there, and everyone else can go away. It's about a long-term engagement of making sure that the cloud program is running quickly, is running well with best practices in place. You've got to think about, you know, you're building a long-term solution, so you've got to do some cleanup every now and again to make sure things are running properly. You know, you've got to put petrol in the car to keep it going. So there's a lot of engagements that you've got to continue doing with our joint customers. So I really think that it's actually a better long-term engagement opportunity than simply helping, you know, build a little few workflows with Terraform open source in mind. Customers can be new to infrastructure as code. It's less likely these days. I think the majority of organizations globally use Terraform in some way, shape, or form. But of course, the lack of skill they might think that, you know, they're not going to see the value of investing in a product or buying Terraform Enterprise. You know, it'll take a little while, so they're not sure, and you know, things like that. But again, this is where you as the partners can win really big with our customers, because you have the skills to impart on our customers. You can provide them with training, with content, with experience. You can build out some of the stepping stones for our customers and really dedicate a lot of time and effort with them. And again, it's about becoming that longer term partner to onboard new areas of organizations with infrastructure as code. And the last one is it's a bit of fun, really. Some customers don't really want, they can't be bothered to migrate from open source to enterprise. And really it just touches on, again, some of the experience we've seen where if they're not migrating, there's a lot of cleanup they will need to do in the future. You as partners could probably do some of that cleanup work for them. You could handle the migration, and then they won't be left in a situation where, again, possibly, you know, a live application could be taken down, not intentionally by anyone in the organization using Terraform open source, but just because there's no guardrails, there's nothing in place to say, you know, these modules are recommended by the customer, you know, within the organization. There's no policy checks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not malicious, but it's just, it is what it is. You go straight to cloud, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So again, your skills as partners, you can start to drive some of the automation, you can start to drive some of the migration programs. It's about building longer term pieces of work with our joint customers. So I'm going to stop there and hand back over to Connor for Q&A. So I think some of the questions have been coming in throughout. Apologies for my screen not sharing at the beginning there, but happy to answer some questions going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Mark. A couple of questions that have come through, and I'll start with one for you, Mark. Does Terraform help with data center to data center migrations as well?
That's a great question. For me, there's two ways to answer this question. The first one, of course, is a clear yes. But in reality, I would say the main important thing is how Terraform helps your disaster recovery scenario, right? Because if you are asking this question, I assume that all your current infrastructure has been created either manually or semi-manually. And in case that the data center went through any kind of problem, so I was once in a data center that was literally flooded. So we're trying to take service out because before we got electrocuted, right? It's not the greatest scenario to be in, but how do you ensure that your business continuity is okay, is healthy, right? And this is one of the things where Terraform really helps. If you define all of this as infrastructure as code, as soon as you need to migrate to another data center or to a cloud or anything else, for any situation, you can just run the code somewhere else and you get the same infrastructure back.
Fantastic. And maybe just building upon that slightly further is, where can I find more learning resource for Terraform in general?
That's a great question. We have a very good learning portal, and I'm not saying very good because it's ours, but it's because I really find it useful. It's called learn.hashicorp.com, and you have all kinds of examples there. And I use it myself sometimes when I have a question about any of our technologies.
Okay, and just
there's also just to add to that, Connor. Sorry, there's learn.hashicorp.com, but there's also a bunch of resources, webinars, everything that we've ever done is pretty much recorded and online, there's loads of online courses as well. So we have someone who works for Hashi, I can't remember his name, has done a bunch of online courses based on our Learn platform. So there's a lot out there, but the best place to start would be the Learn portal.
Cool. Thank you, Caroline. Mark, just a final question from you is, can partners offer health checks to customers who are already using Terraform open source, or is it only HashiCorp that can do this?
That is a great question. I think that's part of our partner experience, right? Because one of the things that we really want is that the partners are able to offer their services, but also that the longevity of the installation and the practice of the installation are the best ones. So we do have health cards and health scores for the installations that the partner can go through. So we offer that service as well, of course. But we normally prefer if the same partner that did the install is capable of going through all these and checking that everything is in place.
Okay, and Caroline, just to wrap up with the question to you is, I have some customers already using open source. How would you recommend we approach this and sell together?
Good question. So the best way to approach it is to kind of understand where Terraform sits within that customer's workflow. Is it being used quite widely, or is it just like a really small, set of engineers or developers that are using it? So it's good to understand the kind of strategic nature of Terraform as a product at that company first. That will then inform you, if it's something that, hey, everybody uses it and it's kind of a free-for-all and we just, provision infrastructure as and when. The question is, okay, what are you doing to mitigate risk? What are you doing to control costs? What are you doing to provide infrastructure to areas of that organization that aren't skilled in infrastructure as code? So how are you delivering services to, say, I'll give you an example. Pharmaceutical company, their engineers will write infrastructure as code because they're engineers and they understand HCL. Whereas a data scientist who just needs an infrastructure to crunch some data just wants to literally file a ticket, right, and get infrastructure. And they're kind of okay with filing a ticket and waiting. But what if they could do something like fill in a ServiceNow form and then get that infrastructure straight away? So there's loads of questions about like, how is Terraform delivering for other areas of the organization if it's something that is a critical tool. And yeah, we just asked a bunch of questions around, you know, how are they mitigating risk, how are they, you know, controlling costs, and really just try and qualify if it is actually critical to them. Because if it's not, it will be difficult to move them away without some sort of critical mass. You know, our open source products are very, very good for individual users. So if there's just one user in an organization, you're not really going to probably get the funding and the business case for Terraform Enterprise. Whereas if it's, well, we've got 100 developers and we're supporting 50 business units, then you can start to dig in with those types of qualification questions.
Okay, and I think we've got one final question actually that just came through on the chat, is how do you convince an AWS shop that Terraform, from a technical standpoint, if the comfortability is high and they don't have time to invest in Terraform? Now, I assume that's alluding or referring to CloudFormation there. So kind of how are we positioning Terraform against that?
Yeah, that's a good one. And if they're really comfortable with CloudFormation, I would say be careful, just pick your battles, because if you're trying to get someone to adopt Terraform completely, like they've never used it before, it's very, very rare, but if they've never used it before, try and figure out and think about less about moving them away from CloudFormation and understanding, is AWS really their only infrastructure provider? Do they have plans to do anything else? Are they multi-cloud in any type of planning? Even if it's like a year from now, 2 years from now, try and figure that out first. But fundamentally, AWS actually recommend Terraform themselves. So even if you're having that conversation, the AWS team that work with these accounts, with these customers, they will probably recommend Terraform too. It's much quicker. It starts to provision different and more services. So I touched on everything as code earlier on, and I really just talked about policy, but Terraform itself is everything as code in the sense of what you can get and provision from AWS and then other services. So if they're using things like Datadog or an F5 firewall or whatever is a complementary service, they can describe that entire set of services they want to provision in one plan and apply with Terraform. So get to know their ecosystem, get to know their cloud strategy. Is it really multi-cloud? And then figure out, do they have the drive, the skill, the want to switch? And if they do, if one of those things kind of jumps out, then you as the partner can start to coach them and start to teach them how to use Terraform and why it's beneficial.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. And I said that was the last one, but we've actually just had another one. So keep them coming. But Mark, probably one for you this time is we started last year in some time with Terraform to build our new Azure landing zone. Currently, we are still working with open source. We do not work with policies, but the support thing could be interesting. Could we use Terraform to support code validation or something else?
So this is I would say for me, it's a two-ways answer. This is where I would say all partners provide a lot of value, right? They are experts in Terraform. They know the code inside out. So my recommendation is, if you're building an Azure landing zone, and I know the complexity of building that myself, have a good partner support you throughout this journey, and to be able to provide that experience and that service to you. And once before you go to production, then of course, as I said, with our support, we'll be able to solve any last minute problems that you may have, but also support you to be able to keep that Azure landing zone running 24/7 or based on your business requirements.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So with that, thank you to Mark again. Thank you to Caroline for this excellent session. Now, as Mark mentioned right at the beginning, our next partner masterclass will take place on the 18th of May. And for that session, we'll focus on HashiCorp Vault. I'll pop a link to that in the chat shortly. Also, just a reminder, this webinar was recorded and we'll share that with you via email in the next 24 hours. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's masterclass. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.